The precursor of elevator music is also the guy who started his own religion. And, believe it or not, he probably walked a lobster around the streets of Paris at least once. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're in for a doozy because we're talking about Erik Satie. Oh yeah. Erik Alfred Leslie Satie was born in May of 1866 in the north of France, and his first musical training came at the hands of an organist when he was 6 years old, right after the death of his mother. He continued these lessons enough to the point where he became competent enough in the musical realm to begin composing his own pieces, and when he was a teenager actually had several light salon pieces published. In 1879, which would have made him 13 years old, he entered the Paris Conservatoire, but he was not a particularly good student. Lazy and worthless were some of the nicer terms that his professors used to describe him. He was there ostensibly for piano studies, but even his piano professors said that his only real musical talent lay in the realm of composition. He was effectively expelled for several years, but ended up getting back into the program when he was 19. The result was exactly the same, he just was not a particularly adept pianist. In 1881, Émile Decombe said that he was the laziest student in the Conservatoire, and that seemed to have held throughout his entire career there. This is primarily because, though he could play a popular tune in the nightclub, he wasn't a good sight reader, and thus could never become a top-rate performer of others' music. That, combined with a shoddy work ethic, meant that he was expelled twice. So what does a twice washed-up pianist do? Well, he joins the French army, that's what. Except he just gave himself bronchitis and then was summarily discharged. So that ended that. In 1887, he moved to Montmartre, one of Paris's more artsy districts, located on a hill. It was around this time that his first serious pieces were published, pieces that constitute the beginning of his actual compositional career. These were the Sarabands and the Trois Gymnopédies, both published by a poet friend's father. The Gymnopédies are the pieces most associated with Satie, and they're beautiful and revolutionary in their simplicity. Major seventh and modal sonorities and a consistent bass underlay beautiful and heart-wrenching melodies. They're some of the most iconic piano pieces, aside from like Clair de Lune or a Chopin Nocturne. Everyone's heard them, you just might not know exactly what it's called. Diving into the Gymnopédies is a video in its own right and might actually rival this one in terms of length, but suffice it to say here that Gymnopédie was a word that Satie just flat made up. He'd do this for a lot of his pieces, but the Gymnopédies are interesting because, well, they're the first of his pieces to do this. The pieces may have been inspired by the poetry of Petits Contamines de la Tour, or of stylized and naked Greek youths dancing on vases, or we just don't know. Again, he made this word up. When asked what his profession was later on, Satie would reply that he was a gymnopedist, which he defined as one who measures sounds. But this has absolutely no relation to anything even remotely associated with the root word he probably derived the word from in the first place. Later in life, he continued this theme and provided the same definition for a different word, phonometrographer. He claimed then that he was more scientist than composer, and that his measuring of sounds and writing them down was something to which he could owe his vast fortunes. But we can't take any of this seriously because he lived in squalor most of his life. This period also features the Nocturnes, another word he made up, but one that probably has something to do with his involvement in Gnosticism. More about that in just a second. And the Ogives, which is not a word he made up. It's actually an architectural term that refers to the arches of Gothic cathedrals. All three collections feature pieces that are very similar to the other pieces in that collection. All the Gymnopédies are very similar to each other, all the Nocturnes are very similar to each other, and all the Ogives are very similar to each other as well. Now to address the elephant in the room for anyone who has any idea of who Satie is. He was a bit of a goofy character. Oh, who am I kidding? He was wildly eccentric. That's why we love him. In the early 1890s, Satie got caught up in the mystical Order of the Rose and Cross, a Gnostic sect whose members claimed secret knowledge on the inner workings of the world. He got fed up with them within relatively short order and decided that he would go and found his own church, which ended up claiming all of one member, which was naturally himself. He called it the Metropolitan Church of the Art of Jesus the Conductor, and he used it as a platform to offer up his wacky and hilariously Dadaistic writings to the world. This was around the same time that he literally up and challenged the petty opera director, a fellow named Eugene Bertrand, to a duel, because Bertrand wasn't enthusiastic about staging a new Satie ballet that tied into his weird religious beliefs. He even went so far as to send a letter to Camille Saint-Saëns, the president of the prestigious French Academy, to demand inclusion into their exclusive club. Satie was friends with Claude Debussy, and the two composers seemed to think quite a bit of the other, even though their relationship would eventually sour because their fans would turn on each other. Satie once confided in Debussy that he had this great Wagnerian operatic spectacle planned about a lobster who gets tracked. Did I mention that Satie probably owned a lobster at one point and tried to walk him around the streets of Paris? Because as hard as it is to get your head around that probably happened. Speaking of Wagnerian spectacles, Satie was known to hoist various hoaxes on the unsuspecting public and masterminding various tricks in the press, the first of which was the supposed composition of a Wagner spoof known as Les Batailles de Tristan. I'm not going to provide a translation for that. Satie was mostly nocturnal. He hated the sun, and in fact he even went so far as to hoard umbrellas. It was said that they found over 100 in his apartment after he died. He was the pianist in the famous Les Chat Noirs nightclub from 1888 to 1891, a post he found degrading because he essentially played for peanuts. He always carried a hammer with him when he was walking to and from the nightclubs in his apartment because, you just never know when one's going to come in handy. You might just have to build a cabinet for somebody on the side of the road. You'd want to be ready for that situation. 1893 saw two important relationships form. The first was the only known romantic involvement of his life, 6 months with his next-door neighbor, the painter Suzanne Valadon. She was somehow more wild and free-spirited than he, if you can believe that. They stayed together for the aforementioned 6 months until she moved away. But they spent so much time together that Satie actually proposed to her on their first date. I mean, if that didn't scare her off, what would? The second major important relationship to form was with the young hotshot Maurice Ravel, who would later be an important figure in establishing Satie in the musical canon. In 1895, a little bit of inherited money allowed him to purchase 12 identical gray velvet suits, which he wore on rotation for the rest of his life, and they called him, because of this, the Velvet Gentleman. This instead of investing in a better living arrangement, which wasn't a good idea. He actually had to crawl back to his quasi-estranged brother Conrad just to make ends meet. Money was made as, well, what else, a cabaret pianist. Many of his pieces from this era, that is, the turn of the century, have a characteristic, almost stereotypical turn-of-the-century French sound, and they're very popular both in their song forms and their solo piano incarnations. Satie didn't think much of these because they were basically grist for the nightly mill. He played them just to make some money, and that was it. From 1898 onwards, he lived in a one-room apartment in Achiel, an industrial suburb of Paris, which was a 10-kilometer round trip to and from work. Satie knew that he needed to gain compositional chops, and so on the eve of turning 40, he enrolled in the Schola Cantorum, a conservative musical institution founded by the extremely conservative Vincent d'Indy. He took classes by day and played in the cabarets by night. No one could understand why this mediocre pianist and twice washed-up conservatoire student would bother enrolling in the Schola Cantorum. But again, Satie knew that he needed to gain whatever knowledge that he could get. He had no knowledge of counterpoint and had no real knowledge of form either. And it was at the Schola Cantorum, not the Conservatoire, that students were provided a real grounding in these fundamental aspects of composition. It was basically, I don't want to say it was all counterpoint, but there was a lot of counterpoint, and that was something that Satie desperately needed in his compositional toolbox. The downside was that, being a very conservative institution by nature, originality wasn't super encouraged, but Satie went through it anyway and caught up on all the things he didn't learn in his 2 small, short stints at the Conservatoire. The good news is that his 5 years of study there didn't radically alter his form. He just added counterpoint, which was his main goal, into his compositional style, and he had a working knowledge of form that he could use in order to structure some of his larger pieces, even though it's arguable if he ever actually used this knowledge. A critic once said that Satie's music had no form, and so Satie responded by writing 3 pieces in the form of a pair, a collection which contains, Well, it actually contains 7 pieces. We think that Satie could count, but he just chose not to. This collection was actually a particular favorite of Satie's, and he even raved about it in a letter to Debussy, where he also referred to himself almost exclusively in the third person, which, par for the course at this point. Satie realized that French music was at a crossroads, as Debussy had just had his first and only opera Pelléas et Mélisande premiered. Like the Impressionists, he cast aside the idea that all music had to develop its themes, something that they all saw as inherently Germanic, and thus something to be avoided at all costs and or in a hazmat suit. Almost none of Satie's pieces do this. He preferred to just say what he had to say and then get out of the way. Bach's music, as a result, bored him. In the second decade of the 20th century, Satie's popularity began to rise. Riccardo Vinius and Maurice Ravel were 2 pianists who played a lot more of Satie's music, and actually credited Satie as being an artistic forerunner of theirs, which helped to establish Satie's position in the minds of the musicians who had theretofore looked down upon him if they had known about him at all. This led to the split between Satie and Debussy, caused by their respective fans who each thought that the one had ripped off the other, even though that was far from the case. If anything, they represented 2 poles of a changing French artistic idiom. They were very different composers, and it's not fair to say that something that Satie did was something that was ripped off by Debussy, or vice versa. It just doesn't apply. Much the same way in which a comparison between Debussy and Ravel, where their fans got into the same kind of argument, doesn't really hold water either. They're all very different composers. Just because they were French composers of roughly the same era doesn't mean they necessarily need to be compared in that way, and it still frustrates me that some people do. This wasn't helped by Ravel's circle of artistic troublemakers, who openly professed their preference for Pries Schola Cantorum Satie, much as the mighty handful in Russia had railed against musical academicism. They were railing against musical academicism that was also extremely conservative, which happened to be both the Schola Cantorum and the Petit Conservatoire at the time. But for more on that, I do have a video about Ravel. One of the late great works of Satie's was for a Cubist ballet called Panade, where Pablo Picasso actually did the set design. Satie provided a whimsical score that includes all sorts of crazy percussion instruments, including a typewriter and a pistol. Not a live pistol. Although that would be exciting. Could shoot a violist. When a critic made a few disparaging comments, Satie sent him a nasty postcard that very nearly landed the composer in prison. Because he prefigured a lot of these modernist artistic movements, he became sort of a godfather to a lot of the movements when they actually started going in the artistic mainstream. And so he became sort of the grandfather of the new French school that became known collectively as Les Six. And it should be noted that Satie was a precursor of very many things, and he was writing this weirdly modernist music before Stravinsky or Messiaen began their illustrious careers. In the later part of the decade, Satie would write what he called furniture music. This was music that was intended to exist, but not be actively listened to. This was a novel concept, and it was not something that really took hold of the Parisian public. For instance, when Satie and his cronies would set up in an art gallery and start playing, all the patrons at the art gallery would stop looking at the art and they'd start paying attention to these nice performers who were playing in their midst. And Satie was just really bummed out that he could never get the public to stop paying attention to them. Little would he know that this actually started what we now know as background music, or ambient music, or heaven forbid, elevator music. Yes, Satie is the grandfather of Muzak. You can hate him for that if you want. I still love him. By the end of the decade, his drinking had turned into an absinthe-centric alcoholism, which gave him horrible cirrhosis of the liver, and he all but withdrew from composition, save for a beautiful set of 5 nocturnes. Like his earlier collections, they share characteristics within the set of rhythmic profile and mood, but these show a much more wistful side of Satie's, with none of the joie de vivre associated with his earlier acts. Falling out with his few friends and the lack of respect from the Parisian critical public led him to a very low point in his life, and he died in July 1925 at the age of 59. Satie is perhaps best known for 2 things in his written music. The first is an almost complete disregard for bar lines, save for the early sarabands and gymnopedes and the late nocturnes, which constitute the bookends of his career. He uses bar lines in those, but even if the rest of his music in between falls into a steady rhythmic pattern, he doesn't use bar lines. Note that this is the solo piano music, which constitutes the bulk of his output. The larger ensemble things, when he'd write them, had to use bar lines just for the sake of coordinating the ensemble. And the second thing that really makes Satie's music stand out on the page is his use of some of the most bizarre performance instructions ever written. How exactly are you supposed to play like a nightingale with a toothache? Do nightingales even have teeth? I know some birds have teeth, but I don't know about nightingales. I'm not an ornithologist. Should I call the Audubon Society about this? We need to straighten this out. Or, even worse and more existential, what are you supposed to do when he instructs you to play with utmost silence? Buddy, you wrote notes! Not only were these in the music as character markings, but he'd also include some of the most nonsensical stuff in the margins. Let's take, for instance, his piece Vexations for solo piano. In the margin, you can see an instruction that tells the performer how they should prepare themselves if they wished to play the piece 840 times in succession. At no point does he say in this that you need to play the piece 840 times. The piece doesn't have an ending bar line, and it doesn't have any indication at the end of the piece. It's just in this corner. A little addendum that says, if you want to play it 840 times, this is how you do it. Turns out that some people have actually taken this as gospel, that Satie actually wanted them to play it 840 times in succession. And there's no way one person can do this, even if they do as Satie asks and prepare themselves with serious immobilities. It's become sort of like the ultimate replicable performance art, and John Cage was one of the first to actually organize a performance where he got a bunch of pianists together, including himself, and they traded off and actually were able to play the thing 840 times in succession. Why? I don't know. They took it seriously when, really, in my opinion, it shouldn't be taken seriously. Again, he never said it had to be played 840 times in a row. Sorry, pet peeve. I have some pet peeves when it comes to this stuff. His piece names that weren't those of his own invention were such classics as Great Flabby Preludes for a Dog, Menus for Childish Purposes, Sketches and Exasperations of a Big Boob Made of Wood, and one of my personal favorites, Desiccated Embryos. Now, Desiccated Embryos isn't the funniest of all of those I just mentioned, but what I find funny is that all the pieces in that collection are about, like, dried up sea cucumbers. His dingy one-room apartment was filled with hoarded items and loose, unorganized papers, at the center of which lay two grand pianos sandwiched on top of one another. No one, aside from Satie himself, had set foot in that apartment while he was alive, leading to a build-up of what was only described as an indescribable squalor. Around, in, and behind these pianos lay many compositions that were found, collected, edited, and published after his death, to satisfy the need for new Satie pieces whenever his fame arose around the mid-1960s. Such was the fate of the 4th through 6th Nocturnes, which not only have no aesthetic similarity to themselves, they don't have any aesthetic similarity to any of the first 3 Nocturnes, which, as I mentioned, have a lot of similar characteristics. If he'd written those and intended them to be Nocturnes, it would be very obvious. Instead, that was a result of an overzealous editor who wanted to put out a Satie piece that wasn't just untitled. Satie put a really high bar for himself by writing these crazy titles for his pieces. And so, saying Untitled Satie piece number 35 or 36 or 37 or whatever these were wouldn't have sold well. But it does make it seem like he wrote Nocturnes when he actually didn't. He was a prolific writer, and his writings probably have to be resigned to another video entirely just to take a look at them. And they're all wacky and Dadaistic, and included publication in Vanity Fair of all places. According to a memoir, he only ate white food, and this included such gluttonous acts as consuming 150 oysters in a single sitting, or a massive 30-egg omelet that we can only assume was from the egg whites. It seems crazy, but the current record for oysters eaten in a single sitting is 624, and if that's possible, a 30-egg omelet made out of white seems like a walk in the park. He claimed to have a very odd yet very punctual schedule, refused all soap, and claimed that his doctor told him that he should smoke. Which, back then, probably was the least crazy of all the things he ever wrote, but you can never take his writings seriously because they're all wacky. You don't read Satie to get some kind of philosophical insight onto the world. Plato this ain't. It's hard to quantify just how important Satie was to the history of music, from Les Six and the future of French music thereafter, to elevator music and the background music that pervades our everyday life. By putting paper on the piano strings, he invented the prepared piano well before John Cage decided to stick nuts and bolts in the wires. He is far, far more important than simply being the composer of the poignant and immediately recognizable gymnopédies. Satie must be understood on his own terms, and the category where he fits best is one entirely by himself.